Hello, everyone. Everyone, welcome to another episode of the How to Be an Anti-Racist Book Club. I'm your boy Nick P. You know, the guy with the beard. Um, Tonight's going to be a little different. My co-host is, as you know, last Sunday was Easter, and my co-host is a brilliant Reverend pastor preacher. And you know, Easter Sunday is one of the most busiest times of the year for pastors, so he's taking a break this evening. So, I'll be your host this evening, but I would like to introduce to you all my special guest for this evening, who is none other than my brother and friend, Minister Tavis Tinsley. How you doing this evening, brother?
Good to be here. It's been a day. Been typing out some papers, but overall it's been productive.
Good, 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 good. Yeah, I completely understand that. It's the end of the winding down to the end of the semester where we're seniors, and you know we got those papers to work on. So Um, but I really appreciate you for joining me in this conversation this evening, this very pivotal, riveting conversation that we're having. So, for all of y'all who have been tuning in with me, you know the deal. I want to just give a shout out to all of our sponsors. First of all, thank you to my church home, which is St. Luke United Methodist Church in Augusta, Georgia. Thank you so much, Reverend Luther B. Felder, who's my pastor and spiritual father, advisor, mentor. Thank you so much for being there for me and for supporting me in this endeavor, which actually birthed out of my senior capstone project. Also, I want to give a thanks to Gammon Theological Seminary at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, for being the platform host for this book club. I started out just doing it on Facebook Live, and my school, Gammon at the ITC, was willing to take on and take it to another level so that I could have other people join in the conversation with me actually on camera. Also, shout out to Poetry Girl LLC and shout out to Adwin Media LLC, media companies that are very integral in making this endeavor happen. Also, shout out to Jackson State University, the Wesley Foundation there. Thank you all for your support. Um, I know y'all miss Rev Kev just like me. Rev Kev, who's my co-facilitator, is also the chaplain at Jackson State. So thank you to the Wesley Fellowship Foundation at Jackson State University for supporting this endeavor. So without further ado, we're going to go into our Sankofa moment. In case you're wondering, what is Sankofa? What does that mean? Sankofa is a West African Adinkra symbol, which basically means to go back and fetch it. What does that mean? So I'm glad you asked. To go back and fetch it basically means so as we're moving forward in life, sometimes we have to kind of pause and go back and get some of the things that happened in our past. Maybe it's a moment where God reminded us, or God reminds us of how God brought us through. Maybe it's a scripture that you've read. Maybe it's a paper that you wrote before that you got to go back to and kind of pull something from that paper to kind of get you through your final, your current paper that you're writing. But we all have to go back and fetch it in life to retrieve some of those jewels that took us through before to keep moving forward. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that principle to go back and fetch some of the wisdom that we got from the book that we're reading, which is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Such a brilliant book. I recommend that you get the book for yourself if you haven't. But thank you for joining us this evening, regardless of if you read it or not. We also want you to feel welcome to comment. Please like, share this broadcast so that we can spread this message of anti racism to the world at large. But we want to go back, starting from the top, chapter one. Ibram X. Kendi talks about definitions, and in definitions, sometimes we kind of throw around the words racist and But we really don't have a solid definition to really define what racism is, or at least what it means for us. And he gives us the definition, his definition of racist and anti-racist. He defines anti-racist as one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. He defines a racist as one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. And then we keep trudging forward to chapter 2, which was called Dueling Consciousness, which was inspired by um, by W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness. And he talks about how we dangerously take double consciousness and then we actually duel against ourselves and form this dueling consciousness. We duel against our truth. And he talks about, he defines assimilationist, segregationist, and anti-racist. Um, so I want you to kind of go back and look at that definition for those definitions for yourself as we trudge forward. But chapter 3 is about power, and he gives the definition of race. And this definition is critical because it helps to shape what he means by power and how the construct of race can be used as power of oppression in and of itself. But he defines race as a power construct of completed or merged difference that lives socially. So it's a construct that creates a overt definition or um, compartmentalization of people based upon how they look, and those differences are lived out socially. Um, so chapter 4 was about biology, and he gives a definition of a biological racist, and we would know that the antithesis would be the anti-racist. But the biological racist is one who is expressing the idea that the races are meaningfully different in their biology, and that these differences create a hierarchy of value. So the anti-racist would be one who vehemently works to uphold a counter narrative. Um, and then chapter 5, he talks about ethnicity. He talks about ethnic racism, which is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between racialized ethnic groups and are substantiated by racist ideas about racialized ethnic groups. So ethnic racism is very profound, and how we kind of take in, even as Black people, we may take in a particular ethnic group within the Black race. So we may say that people who are African or from this particular part of the continent, we kind of even marginalize even within ourselves. So African Americans, we may have certain views about African Americans, and we may have certain views about Africans as well. So it talks about those racial constructs there and that oppression there in chapter 5. Chapter 6, he talks about bodily racist. He talks about body, and he gives a definition of bodily racist, which is one who is perceiving certain racialized bodies as more animal-like and violent than others. So that helps to perpetuate, or that helps to speak to those false notions about the Black body as being animalistic, and the Black body as we as Black people being instinctively criminal or thugs or violent. When we think of an angry Black woman or an angry Black man, that false preconceived notion that is placed upon the Black body. Um, that's what he talks about in that chapter. Chapter 7, he talks about culture. This was a really interesting chapter to me. And he talks about a cultural racist is one who is creating a cultural standard and imposing a cultural hierarchy among racial groups. So cultural racism goes into, like, when we say that a particular race should assimilate to a particular culture. or when we require, it shows up in the church a lot of times when we want a particular group to assimilate to a particular worship expression. Um, so that cultural racism shows up. Cultural anti-racism would be vehemently seeing that and working against making sure that we have various cultural expressions present in the workplace, in the school, in the church. But that was a good chapter. Um, Chapter 8 talks about behavior. Behavioral racist, according to Dr. Kendi, is one who is making individuals responsible for perceived behavior of racial groups and making racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. So, what he means by that is when one black person does something and all of a sudden all black people are responsible, or one brown person or anyone does something, and then society automatically blames that entire group for that one person. Or we may say this one person is responsible for perceptions about a race. So I automatically, or even you, brother Tavis, have been a victim of misinterpretations of what being a black man is, and so you as an individual may be accused, and that's how we get so many victims in America that look like us, because that individual is held accountable for misperceived um, notions. Also, in chapter 9, he goes into talking about color and colorism. This was a very like self. This is a very important chapter for us as Black people, and he talks about colorism, which is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequities between light people and dark people, supported by racist ideas about light and dark people. So this goes, we've had that history of, the brown paper bag tests in so many social groups and even churches, where it's perceived that if your hair blows on the wind, that's better. If you're lighter, you're righter. Um, but he's talking about how that is also a form of oppression, and he highlights how that shows up and that's perpetuated by racism and white supremacy. How those two, how racism and white supremacy are the foundation of colorism. In chapter 10, he talks about anti-white racism. Um, and so this was a chapter that was really, um, it me, Rev Kev and I, we kind of wrestled with this chapter a lot. But he talks about how one who is classifying people of European descent as biologically, culturally, or behaviorally inferior, or conflating the entire race of white people with racist power. So that's what he's asserting, is that when we blame all white people for um, a perceived racism that we may have for all white people. So he's talking about how anti-white racism shows up, um, and that is his counter narrative to the claim that black people can't be racist. So of course, we all scholars, we all have our own varying opinions. No one is right. I kind of wrestle with that notion myself, in the sense of I don't know if that language is really empathetic. Um, it's completely empathetic, but I that's just my view. But then he talks about the powerless, or talks about black, just the construct of blackness in chapter 11, and then he talks about the powerless defense, the illusory, um, concealing, disempowering, and racist idea that black people can't be racist because black people don't have power. So this is that counter. He's kind of justifying his former chapter by offering that if we say that black people can't be racist, then what we're also saying is that black people don't have the power to be racist. That we can't, because often what people say is that black people can't be racist because we don't have the power to oppress. But what he's offering is that then you're rendering black people as powerless. Um, so my view is differing. That I don't think when people are offering that black people can't be racist because they don't have the power, It's not because they in existential don't have the power. I think it's because that we live in a system that is built upon. It's not built upon the of like equity. So we're in a capitalistic context where if one wants to kind of conquer another, one has the that competition. So it's not really, we don't live in a system that favors equity, that if someone does not have, then society should give or be empathetic to the other person that doesn't have. And so I think that whenever we're in a system that is built upon, okay, if you just have it and you want to take it, you can. It doesn't always give, the system doesn't always give power to the oppressed. But I do believe in divine power that we all have. Um, so it just depends on your perspective there. But I think that we all should kind of have our own perspectives, and I think that's the importance of dialogue, of conversation. Chapter 12, he talks about class, and he talks about class racism or racist, which is one who is racializing the classes, supporting policies of racial capitalism against those race classes and justifying them by racist ideas by those race classes. Um, and what he defines as an anti-racist, anti-capitalist is one who is opposing racial capitalism, like what I just said. Um, when you view a certain community as being um, of a lower class, just like when we talk about integration and how what happened in that is actually kind of what we call white flight, right? So, um, which is based upon this notion of class. So we may think of others as marginalized people as um, some may view them as existentially not as valuable as they are. So, what a class racist may perpetuate is this idea that that racial groups aren't equal, and therefore they perpetuate these unequal classes as well. So he's bringing in the conversation of race and class. Um, and chapter 13, he talks about space. We're getting closer to 14. He talks about racism, or it's called space, but then he defines space racism as a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to resource inequity between racialized spaces, or or the elimination of certain racialized spaces, which are substantiated by racist ideas about racialized spaces. So the obvious thing that pops up, that may pop up in your mind, is talking about gentrification. When we think about class, and how when we automatically think of a black institution, a black space, a black community, a black space, that automatically we attach class to that space. And then we also attach a racism to that space. So often, black spaces, people may think that that's not for them, or they may not, either patronize there, view the education system as being equal. Um, so that space, we can racialize or oppress that particular space. Um, but before we go into 14, um, I want to pause, and I want to ask my brother Tavis, did any of, because that was a lot. That was, of course, a mouthful, but did any of that kind of radiate with you? Because I know a lot of that, it was very controversial, it was very jarring, to say the least. But when we kind of have these conversations, as we should, we kind of get to truth. Truth is always going to be jarring. It's always going to cause you to wrestle, and I think the wrestling is not bad. It's the lack of ability to wrestle and be patient and sit in the wrestling. which causes that division. Was there any wrestling that you experienced while listening to?
Um, I think looking at, I think you said body racism and how certain characteristics of a particular race can be called out and stigmatized towards something. I think I've experienced that the most with my hair, and how I like to wear my hair, whether it's down or it's up, and the looks from people that I get, the perceptions that, even the compliments, the backhanded compliments that I have received that are seen as like the "oh, you're so articulate," when they expect me to be like a basketball player or a football player. And when I say they, I mean anybody outside of the of my own race. Um, don't you play sports? And when I tell them I'm an academician, it kind of throws them for a loop because I don't fit the image of what an academician should look like. Um, and I think actually with the articulation of what it means to be racist and how it relates to power is a conversation that I've had in multiple of my classes here while in seminary. And I do think it is really good to hold and dissect your own perspective because when I read that and when I hear you talk about those two, the justifying chapter as well as the chapter that does the introduction, I think I agree a lot. I think I lean more towards the existential power that people hold. It holds a lot more weight than people give it credit for. But I also would like to say that realizing that you are in a system of oppression that does not provide you with equity and is built off those two concepts, that is extremely important in recognizing when you're going about how to exercise the power that you maintain. So those are the two things that I think I wrestle with the most.
I think that's powerful, especially because when you say when people look at you, they expect an athlete. They expect you to be an athlete. Not just that, but when you say you're an academician, they're surprised. So it's like a double whammy. Not
Right.
only do they automatically expect you to be an athlete, which is nothing wrong with that, but you
Right.
know, then they're surprised that you not only do you read a book every now and then, but you're actually
Right.
a theologian. But they're surprised by that.
Right.
But you know what? I wrestle too with some of the conversations that you and I have had. Um, we have to kind of deal with even our own growth opportunities as Black people. And what kind of happens is, even based upon some of the conversations that you and I have, we're kind of guilty of that body racism too. I can't imagine
Right.
how many times, you know, I've been in a church and people have thought because I'm younger that, I'm less capable of ministry or less
Right.
capable of speaking truth to power, leadership. What would you have to say about being a young Black man and people perceiving your youth um,
It is.
as that
It's
author?
interesting that you. Yes, like that's actually what my ministry and context capstone project is about. Um, because
Ah,
I feel like when I step into spaces, especially, my project is called Generational Collaboration. And then to explain the meaning of the project, I deconstruct the two words generational, the stratification of demographics based on age relative thought of collectively, co meaning with or togetherness, labor meaning work, and ation meaning the state or process of. Um, And so when I step into spaces, a lot of times I think like they think, okay, what can I give to this young man? And the notion never pops into a lot of regular churchgoers' minds is what can this young man provide me, and how can we work together in this space to reciprocate value to one another and cultivate one another, because I think when you come into a space and you're a very young man, a lot of people they look at you like they look at their sons, because they put that mental construct in their mind, and a lot of the verbiage that they use is catered towards that sonship. So
Yes, that is so true. Like we have to be careful of how um black people, we have to be careful of how we can hold our even our own community captive. How even not just black men but young black men may experience the certain preconceived notions. Y'all, all y'all young folk, y'all don't want to, whatever it is, y'all don't want to listen. Y'all don't want to, I done heard so many knocks because I'm a
right,
millennial. Which, I mean, there's nothing, good or bad about it, but it's just the fact that, there's this preconceived notion that
right,
you are irresponsible
mm,
or first of all because you're black,
mm,
a black man, and then
right,
your youth added to that. It's we have to be careful about that. Um, but so in this next chapter, he begins to kind of take. So the whole chapter he's turning right. It's a constant pivot. It's a constant evolution that's happening. Every chapter we're kind of wrestling either in a way that we've wrestled before, but more, or in a new way, completely new way. But this particular chapter kind of pivots in a whole new way, and he begins to talk about gender. And in this chapter, he talks about gender racism. He defines gender racism as a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between race genders and are substantiated by racist ideas about race groups. And then he defines gender anti racism as a powerful collection of anti racist policies that lead to equity between race genders and are substantiated by anti racist ideas about race genders. Um, so let me ask you, Brother Tavis. So before we go forward, whenever you think about race, gender, and some of the isms or oppressions that we place on gender and race at the same time, a black woman or a black man or a brown woman or a brown man. What are some of those? What would you walking in? Maybe some you've experienced, maybe you're wrestling with, some that you have grown from in seminary, some that you're fighting against in ministry. What are some of those that maybe, or just some that may come to mind?
um I think that when the whole concept of guy talk, this is guy talk, and usually I was raised by two. I don't want to say strong black women, and not to say that they're not strong, but I think oftentimes we don't. That's another one that we
Yeah.
don't acknowledge the stigma. I would say two cultivating black women. I was raised by my great grandmother and my grandmother, but when it comes to like being around a group of guys and you're talking, it's oftentimes what I have found at the expense of the character and the personhood of women. Um, and it's been normalized to call, especially black women, um, out of their names and not what they are. And confronting that, head on in my friend groups, guys that I'm meeting, because it is so normalized, the verbiage just kind of slips, and not even slips, it's purposed. And standing in that gap, whether it be awkward or not, to go against the grain, to go against the norm, to say, hey, like, women are co-heirs with you, meant to be honored, respected, and co-collaborated with. Um, so it's like, why would you talk about your fellow human being in that way or fashion? And of course, it's met with a lot of resistance because it's like you said, it's a strong group of policies that has been ingrained within the culture itself. So that's what I think. That's the most prominent one that I run into.
That's powerful that you said culture, that policies and the culture, because a lot of times these rules and these policies, they're not written down in a book somewhere. They're entrenched
Right.
and, they're systemically in culture. A lot of the things that we learned are right and wrong about um, black women and black men. Um, but that is a very astute observation in the fact that that's a commonly okayed, if you will, if that's a word I could throw out there, action on part of even our own people towards black women. Um, one of the observations that comes to mind too is even some of the hardships that we black men face because of this notion, this which is a buzzword today, which is an actual part of my senior capstone, talking about toxic masculinity. And when we define our masculinity by our unwillingness to admit um, where we have to grow, admit where we are weak or we need help, or we see that as less masculine. We see ourselves as less of a man um, if we can't, by how many, we judge our masculinity based upon our sexual feats, our sexual conquests, based upon our money, how much money we have, our career. Um, it's so much about that this capitalistic society about gaining, 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 that we have internalized and we use to define our masculinity, which becomes toxic. And we're often not
Right.
even able to address our own areas of that we need to grow, such as often our mental well-being. We're unable to address the need, everyone, not just you. If I'm talking to a black man out there, not just you, your own need, as if you're less for mental care, but everyone's need for mental care. That's a need for everyone. We all need a doctor. Um, for our I guess you could say, what is it, general health, a general care doctor.
Yeah.
We all have just needs as a human being. Um,
Correct.
and mental care is one of those needs. And because of our notions of toxic masculinity that we often bring to the table, and we don't have to bring to the table culture, just like how you were saying, these are systemic
Right.
policies that are intrinsic in our culture that we we either believe or we have to combat. So if a man dares
Mm.
to treat a woman with respect, or if a man, his wife makes more money than he does, society may, you may get that pushback from society that he's less of a man. But I just the notions of toxic masculinity and how we even can blow them, way out of proportion in our own culture, in black and brown cultures. We have these really
Right.
inflated sense of this hyper masculine view that can be toxic. It's like we're eating cardboard. That's not human. A lot of those
Yeah.
things, it's not real
Right.
food. and you're feeding it to yourself like it's nourishment, but it's not nourishing you. It's nourishing to just say, "Hey, I need help with this," or "Hey, um, I just really need to admit that I am hurting," or um, we. It's just how we define masculinity. It can be toxic, not not really edifying, and not really speaking to our truth. Um,
Right.
but did you have any thoughts, especially as one
That
who's passionate about psychology?
um, going through my pastoral care class, I have been talking with my group facilitator, and I was telling her I recognize the existence of hypermasculinity, um, but what does it mean? What is the definition? How do you define non-hypermasculine? Like, what is just masculinity? And what we are left with in society, and what we are left with as men, and I would argue even women, is we are left with these archetypes of what masculinity is, and we do not, because it is a diversified concept. I don't think it is something that's just black and white. Masculinity looks a plethora of ways, so does femininity, but we've been left with these archetypes like shoes to fill, and you pick your pair of shoes, and that's how you walk into society. um, and being in all these classes this semester have been very beneficial, but pastoral care of the black family. Black men oftentimes go into therapeutic settings very distrusting of um, the counselor, the therapist, because intrinsically they think that he is a part of the larger system that is being used to oppress him. So one of the biggest factors in learning to be in a therapeutic setting with a black man or a black family in general is first gaining their trust. Um, so when it comes to psychology, it's when you factor in the society that we live in, going back to the establishment of inequity. We've been programmed. We're set up. We're built to be very socially aware um, of all the things that go into that setting.
That's a very powerful point, because when we talk about toxic masculinity, we then have to ask the question: so what is masculinity? Um, so
Right.
before I kind of go into what my response to that, I wanted to dive into chapter 14, which is about gender. Um, and this book actually opens up with Kendi's adoration of these two women that he meets at Temple University. He starts out the chapter pretty jarring, and it's actually really humanizing, if you will, because he just kind of puts his truth out there, and he just says he arrived to Temple
Yeah.
University as he says a racist, sexist, homophobe. He said he arrives there
Wow.
with those lenses. Um, and then he says that he actually encounters two black women in the African American Studies Department who kind of humble his kind of patriarchal perspective that he brought with him. And he said that these two women, every time he was around, or every time they were around him, he always felt inept, or he always felt in the sense of like ignorant, but not in a negative way, like they were making him feel less. But he was always in awe by how um, profound everything that they said was, even their jokes, how they're joking. They're, how we have, when we have a room full of, especially us, students at the ITC, when we're, when you get five of us in a room, like it's a it's a party, like theologically.
Yeah.
Like we kind of nerd out, right? So
Hmm.
he talks about just being in the company of these black women, and when they're joking, when they're in debates, how every person that dares to combat them always is left speechless. And but he talks about how he offers how black women, because he's talking about race gender, black women's behavior has always been seen as problematic by conservatives and by black men. So he's offering how in 1965, President Johnson's Assistant Secretary of Labor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I think that's how you say his name, Moynihan, published a government report called The Negro Family, the Case for National Action, which reported that one-fourth of black families were headed by women, which was twice the rate of white families. This was deemed a crushing burden on the Negro male. Um, and in 1994, the political scientist Charles Murray calculated that 68% of black children were born into single parent households, to which he blamed the welfare system. So um, he's offering how society has always kind of demonized when you talked about strong black women. And the well, let's say it this way, has always demonized the behavior of black women, and even black women who have aspired to have their own careers and be scholars, but just the audacity, if you will, of black women um, to dare to dream beyond the glass ceiling of society. Um, then we have these notions that we kind of internalize in the black community, and even unfortunately, I've witnessed this archetype called strong black women, that which I assume you were alluding to when you were talking about strong black women, and how um, this idea that women have to be strong overtly, that strength means
Right.
doing all the work, doing having all the jobs and still not crying in front of the kids, still not, taking time for herself to eat a quality meal, to get mental care. I don't have time for all that because I'm strong. I don't
Mhm.
need to, admit, or I don't
Right.
need this person because I'm strong. Those, not necessarily that you need someone, but the fact that um, we have this notion that um, how would you say it? That a woman feels that they have to be strong overtly, that a woman who is strong is one who is willing to um, to seek care, mental
Endure
health
suffering.
care. Yes, um,
Hmm.
and it's not necessarily based upon a all the external feats that we kind of place value
Right.
in. And even as a strong man, we kind of we don't look in. We kind of look out, look at all the things that we're doing. We are all the things in
Right.
place, but we never kind of look within. That's where our
Right.
strength is. So the woman who feels, especially often black women who have to combat so much from society because they're both black and woman. But that notion of I don't have time to even look within, um, which is
Hmm.
dangerous to any human being. But
Yes.
Kendi, I actually, oh, you were gonna say something? Were you gonna say something?
No, I'm just
Oh,
agreeing with that for sure.
okay. But he kind of moves forward and he talks about how Kenny proposed that to talk about injustice towards Black women, it is important to consider identifying Black women as a race gender. So when you talk about intersectional oppression, we often will talk about what it's like to be
Hmm.
Black or what it's like to be woman, but we don't talk about that unique oppression that this race gender Black women
Hmm.
experience. What he says, women as black gender, as issues of race and gender cannot be separate for black women. Black women suffer at the hands of black men and white people alike. And we have to be willing to face that truth that um, black men and white people are often um, the the perpetuators of oppression that black women experience, not just white society, but also us black men. We have to remember that. And what Kendi was saying is when he got to Temple, he had to kind of wrestle with that in and of within himself. He says that black women are victims of high sterilization rates by the state. Black and Native women also experience higher poverty levels than other race gender groups. Further, single white women's median incomes are significantly higher than Black women's incomes. Gendered racism does not only impact Black women, but also white women and Black men. So let me read that again. He's offering gendered racism does not only impact black women, but also white women and black men. Gendered racism portrays white women as weak, leading in antagonist attitudes towards strong white women, like Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election. The portrayal of white women as virtuous is also what has historically turned many black men into the target of rape accusations when they are hypersexualized alongside virginal white women. Some issues of race and gender entwine. And Kendi concludes by stating that to be a feminist is to be an anti-racist, and vice versa. Vice versa. So he's actually proposing this intersection or seeing the intersectional oppression of black women. Um, so like I said, I think that is often overlooked. And even I thought it was interesting too how he talks about the portrayal of white women as virtuous is also has historically turned many black men into target of rape accusations when they are hypersexualized alongside virginal white women. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. In spaces where I have may have been alone with white women. I've kind of been fearful. Like I want to make sure the door is open, make sure that people can see, because um, you know there is that hypersexualized um, that toxic masculine toxic masculinity that as being black and a man, because I'm black and because I'm a man, I'm seen as even more animalistic and sexual. So that gender racism, that's what he's alluding to there, that how we can be viewed as especially animalistic as black men. um, so what are some of your thoughts about that kind of that intersectional gendered racism notion that Wendy is making here?
I think, as a matter of fact, I think that is the second time this week that I have encountered that perspective about black men and virginal white women. It was taught in my house um, to be very leery of situations like that because the people that taught me that were raised in a period of time where that happened quite often. And the caricature, um, it really makes me passionate because it's like that caricature is um, perpetuated by images like the birth of a nation. You got this black man who is nearly identical to a Neanderthal, who is chasing after these black women, and then you have these white um, knights who come in and subdue and or kill this black man who was preying upon white women. But a lot of times in society, I feel like what is not looked at is there's that, but then you also have the sexualization from a perspective standpoint. Yes, it is okay, cool. You look at us as sexual savages, but then also there's this fetish, this sexualization of a black body, like, oh, not that it's favorable, but it still denies a person's personhood. You're
Uh-huh.
only purely looking at my skin and making it a fetish for your appeasement, like, and that's equally as not okay for me. Um, because at then, like, it makes me feel like um, I'm a prize animal. Like, you're gonna catch me and you wanna experiment. I've never had this before. Like, I'm a flavor of food, and that's not okay.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it reminds me of that movie Get Out. I don't know if you've seen that movie.
Yes.
Um, yeah, it
Yes, I have.
reminds me of, how the black body is when he talks about in the I believe it's chapter 6, but he talks about the body and how the racism, of course, obviously is talking about color, but we're not just talking about their color, but we're viewed as more animalistic. The body is viewed as more,
Right.
and something to um, use at capitalistic advantage. This country is built upon um, the capitalization of human bodies, um, taking human bodies um, by force and forcing them to work
Yes.
sun up to sundown, for gain. And oftentimes we were forced, like the most men who were deemed as big and virile, they often had to fight to the death for sports. Um,
Right.
and how even how our bodies are viewed as especially athletic, and we're just taken we're looked at as a pawn, um something to be used
Right.
as for sport, um sexually, athletically. But you're absolutely right. I was also too raised on that concept. I don't know any black man that wasn't, especially black men who are athletes. When you get to, especially when you get to college and you're an athlete. Every black man who's an athlete, your father or your mother have that conversation with you. Be careful
Right.
about you know how society is perceiving you when you get out there in that field and you're sexualized, and all the people who come to you are not doing so with the best intentions. However, that
Right.
this chapter really does challenge us to consider race, gender, or gender race, the intersectional oppression um, that we experience because of gender and race at the same time. But I wanted to, before we close, we started something, I think it was about 2 episodes ago, where we broke out the workbook. So, just in case you
Oh
are
wow.
viewing and you are reading or haven't read, or don't know if you're interested in it, but so here's the book we're reading. But there's also these other little books you can purchase in conjunction with it to kind of um, add depth to your reading. So there's the study guide that you can read. It offers a summary and an analysis on the chapters. So you can have your own kind of like wrestling with the text, with this right here. This can offer a different perspective for you. Also, there's a workbook that is available, which can help you kind of work through a lot of what Dr. Kendi is offering, whether you agree or don't agree. We're not offering that Dr. Kendi's text is truth. We're just offering his narrative for it to inspire conversation. Because I'm gonna be honest with you, a lot of it I agree with it, but not every single point I agree with exactly as he states it. But what I appreciate with it is that he's offering conversation on the concept of anti-racism, not just saying I'm not a racist, but let's do the work of anti-racism, and he's defining what
Right.
racism and anti-racism means for him. But I want to go into this workbook um, and ask some of the questions and see what your responses may be, Brother Tavis.
Okay.
So the first question is you can be an anti-racist without being a feminist, according to the book.
Right.
What would you say, true or false? You
Okay.
can be an anti-racist without being a feminist,
Uh,
according to the book.
I would say yes, um, especially with the definition of feminism that we have here at the ITC.
Mhm, mhm.
So
So, so you believe that you can be, or you're saying that you can be an anti-racist
uh,
without being a feminist?
yes, only on the premise that feminism is more so relating to white women, and it does not include black women who are in the margin of the margins.
So you make a good point. 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 Um, because there is a such thing as black feminism, and it does give credence to that race
Hmm.
gender. Um,
Okay.
I I think that how Kendi is defining feminism, and in this text, I think he's offering that you can't be an anti-racist without being a feminist. And I think he's
Okay.
defining. I think he's defining feminism in a larger scope. I think feminism has
Okay.
often been kind of focused on um, the plight of women and white women being at the forefront and not giving credence to black women and that race gender narrative. But I think he's defining
Hmm.
feminism broadly. That's just me. Um, but there's no right or wrong answer.
Okay.
So let's go to another question. Households which do not discuss homophobia actually promote homophobia. What would you say based upon kind of the conversation we were having? I guess that kind of goes into that toxic
Yes,
masculinity
I
too.
do. Um, yes, I think that the unwillingness to talk about something that is a possible fear is out of fear that the thing that is feared would be developed. Um, so most definitely, I think having information at your disposal, especially at your children, your brother, your sister, your aunt, having that information at the disposal is very important at being able to navigate the society that we live in. So yeah, I do think that.
I agree too. I agree with you because he actually mentions in the book. He talks about how his parents hardly ever talked about the issue of homophobia or homosexuality at all. Um, they rarely talked
Mhm.
about that growing up. Um, and so then he makes the point that when he arrived to Temple, he had this homophobic perspective.
Mhm.
Um, so I agree with you. I think the case that he is making is he believes that homophobia actually promotes, well, not discussing homophobia promotes homophobia. Um, and let me go down to the last question. We're winding down on our time. Um, Gender racism is when a policy or idea creates inequities for Black women, Black men, and any combination of race and gender. Would you say that's true or false?
Definitely, I would agree with that.
I would agree with that too. I think that's the case that he is making. I think he sees any race, any gender that he sees how the unique oppression of any race, any gender concurrently, um, any combination as race as gender racism. Um, but yeah, I totally agree. I think it's good to agree and good to disagree sometimes because we never completely agree. So when we're honest, we can kind of see that there's some things that we kind of disagree on, but we can still be in conversation with one another, which is the whole point in this book club. So we hope that you enjoy the conversation with us this evening. Thank you so much, my brother, again, Minister Tavis Tinsley, for
For
tuning
sure.
in. He has some amazing wristbands that I don't have mine on me, but it's some amazing. He just has some really powerful, edifying, Christian, um, really merchandise too. So make sure you follow him, follow him on Facebook and support his ministry. Look out for him. He has a lot coming, especially within the field of psychology and pastoral care and counseling. But thank you again for tuning in. I'm your boy Nick P. The guy with the beard. Please also, I'm also, brand announcement. I'm running for president. Um, so keep on the lookout. Things coming up. things coming up. Things coming up. Got some things coming up at the ITC. So please follow me on Facebook. Um, Also, you can follow Gammon at Gammon1883 on Facebook, on IG, on Instagram. Follow us there as well. But we hope that you enjoy the conversation, and we want you to just have a great evening, and we want you to join us next week right here on Facebook for the How to Be an Anti-Racist Book Club. Peace.